Hi guys, welcome to the Tools Friday series with FIXITGEARWARE-SECURITY, and I hope you're all doing great today. So this week we'll be doing something quite different. As we promised that this week we'll be doing 2 trainings, which involves one to rectify the issues with running Webgoat on the Windows environment, and the second one is going to be a tool for penetration testers who are interested in learning various tools to perform their various penetration testing activities, and of course uncover attack surfaces and web URLs that have various paths they can possibly exploit. So as you all know, the first Friday of every month is always dedicated to the series of penetration testing and of course demonstration of tools. But for quite some time right now we've not done any tool series, and that has been something we've been looking into to ensure that we have a way to balance it out, and as well, fitting all our programs to match our landmark or scope for the year 2025. Because of we have not been able to do this tool series for quite some time, we decided to push it for this month's cybersecurity and penetration testing series, alternating it with the Tools Friday series as well. So by the time we're done today, you're going to go with a handful of informations that is going to be first help you to learn how to resolve the issues with the Webgoat application for practicing your vulnerability testing and penetration testing skills. And secondly, a new tool that has the capacity to assist you to perform recon activities without the need of you installing this tool locally on your machines, especially for newbies who are financially incapable of providing resources in terms of computing hardwares and so on. So we hope that at the end of the video as well, whatever we are able to pass across to you will be properly understood, and you can use them to your own advantage as well, and of course learn more things from the training. So with that being said, let's get started. So for this week, we'll be resolving 2 issues. One is going to be the installation issues of WEBGOAT2025.3 jar file. And this specific version of Webgoat has a few issues with how users can run it on the Windows environment. And if you come across the official Webgoat GitHub account, you will realize that they did not outline the process of using the jar file on a Windows environment. They only listed how you can run this via Docker. And we believe that as part of the community of this interesting project, which is the Open Web Application Security Project, we believe this is a way we can contribute to that community to show how users who want to run this via cross-platform like Windows environments, who cannot afford computing devices, that can be able to spin up a container such as Docker while practicing this lab, right? So we believe by resolving this issue and putting this out there, you can be able to, configure your Webgoat on your Windows environment, especially if you're running Windows 11 operating system, and be able to use the application to practice these various labs we talk about demonstrating Webgoat. Then the next is going to be LookyLoo. LookyLoo is a very cool tool. And if you're a penetration tester that doesn't have money, you don't know how you can go about, performing live recon to, uncover attack surfaces and so on various domains you got from your passive recognizance, then LookyLoo is for you. We'll show you everything how you can use LookyLoo. Very interesting tool. And you don't need to install it on your local machine. You just have to access it via your browser, and has a very cool UI and some other complex functionalities such as VPN, manipulating your operating system to masquerade, especially when you're performing active recon on this target, right? So you don't want them to detect who you are, to block your IP, and of course limit you from uncovering vulnerabilities or attack surfaces you plan to exploit. So LookyLoo is the cool tool for you, and we're going to show you how you can use this tool and of course, earn some coins or some money when performing, bug bounty or penetration testing related activities. So today for the WebGoat installation solutions, we'll be running a 8-step series. So this 8-step series involves one, we have to first of all download the correct version of the JDK file, because this present or this current version of WebGoat runs with JDK or OpenJDK, and you need to download the actual version that can support these updates of the latest version of the WebGoat jar file. So the lowest it can support is the OpenJDK version 21, and we're going to show you how to download that from the official website of adoptium.net. Then after that, we would show you how you can locate the JDK directory files on your machine, which is the Windows environment. Then once we're done with that, we'll move on to showing you how you have to edit the system variables and the users variables. So users variable is the current user that is logged in, and system variables is for the entire system. So why is it good that we configure this to point to the JDK part is because you'll be running this file from your local machine, and once you're logged in as well, you are logging as the current user, right? So you want this to properly run the WebGoat file without having any issues. So that's the essence of configuring both for the users and the system variables. Then after we're done, we will move on to show you how to download the latest jar file of the WebGoat from the official GitHub link account. And after you've downloaded that, we would now proceed to show you how you can create a batch file or the .bat file that you click to execute this WebGoat version automatically without the need of opening your CMD prompt or CMD terminal to run these commands that we have in step 6. So step 6 is basically trying to state that we want to start the WebGoat, and we want the Java to point in the Java environment, which is associated with the JDK23, which we have installed. Then after that, we would now move on to point to the part where the WebGoat jar file is. So basically, just a rule of thumb, where the .bat file is residing is still going to be the same directory where the WebGoat2025.3 jar file resides. Or if it resides in somewhere else, then you have to make sure you get the appropriate part where it resides, and of course, call it accurately so that when the Java tries to find the file and start it, it's going to be able to locate it. Then finally, we will now save this .bat file. For our own case, we ensure that we follow a very accurate configuration pattern, which involves setting the jar file and the .bat file in one directory. For your case, it depends where you want to set it in, but you just ensure that you save the file as a .bat file to ensure that when you click on it, it's going to run the CMD command. Then after that, we're going to double click the start.webgoat, and you're going to see how the WebGoat commands is to execute on our system. Then we will now log in to show you that it works. So that is all for the WebGoat. Then for the LookyLoo, we will be hitting up the official URL of LookyLoo, which is this, and we'll show you how you can use LookyLoo to perform some active recon on a target using our domain, and of course using multiple domains via the web browser. And trust me, by the time you're done seeing how we demonstrate LookyLoo, you can now possibly exploit and learn more about it. But LookyLoo is a very cool tool, and we're very thrilled to have introduced you into this and to show you this on this week's series. So with that being said, let's get started with, of course, solving the WebGoat installation.jar file series. So first of all, we go to the official Adoptium website, which is this. Now, over on the website, we have various versions of JDK. For some reasons, it's taking time to load. So we have various versions of JDK. We have 21, we have 17, we have 11, we have 8. But the lowest you can use is 21, okay? Now for Windows environment, you download this .msi file. So the .msi file means Microsoft installer. Now, let's say you don't want to use the lowest version that the WebGoat supports. You can come to all versions. You come here, you select your operating system. You say it's Windows. You select the architecture. So for architecture, we know it's 64 and 32 bits. Technically there's no 32 anymore. So you can say ARC64 or 64 bits. Then for the version, you choose if you want to use 21 LTS, you want to use 22, 23, and 24. So currently we're using JDK23. So you can just click this. It's going to, populate the version. Okay. Ignore this zip file. Download this. The reason why you should download this is because basically you want Microsoft to, verify the software, of course, install it on your PC. Then ensure it's JDK, not JRE. Okay. JDK is what you need to download. So we don't need this. We already downloaded the file and we have it here in our directory. So we don't need it. We already have it here in our directory, which is of course the JDK21. And you can see the date we downloaded the file. And over here, you can see we have the WebGoat latest version. So to download the latest WebGoat version as well, you remember our slide. We told you to go to the official website. So if you don't know how to get there, you just follow the instruction here on our video presentation. So you go to official WebGoat and of course you see the latest. Okay. But let's say you're downloading from the WebGoat itself, from the GitHub repository. Once you get here, just click on latest. Okay. And ensure that you come down here and download this one, which is the .jar file. So we don't need this, so we have to cancel this. Okay. So once you're done downloading and, getting these two files, which is the JDK and of course the WebGoat, you install this. Okay. You install the JDK and of course, ensure you know the directory where this is installed. So by right, JDK will be installed on your program files under Java. Okay. You can see we have JDK23. Now ignore the state because we are testing some malware. So we trying to see some stuff with JDK. And here you can see if we hover our mouse, you can see we created this on the 30th of May, 2025. So ignore this date. Okay. So basically we've installed JDK23, right? Now, why is this very important is that you need to note this directory. It's very important that you know this directory because this is what we're going to use to configure the Windows environment. Okay. So once you want to configure the Windows environment, you just come to your Windows here, you start and you search environment variables. You click on edit. So we have the environment variables, right? You just click on environment variables. Now over here, you can see here, we have the variable name and the value. So how do you do that? You just simple, you can click on new if you don't have this, but basically I'll just edit this. So the variable name should be Java_home. And of course, the variable value should be pointing to this JDK directory, which is this one. Okay. Under C program files, Java and JDK23. You need to configure this to be this. So this is under the users variable as well. Okay. Then you come down to the system variable. Okay. You see this. We also configure this here. Okay, you can edit this and see you configure the same thing for Java home and let it point to JDK23 and you click OK. So if you're wondering how you can do this, you just click on new, okay, and you put the variable name to be this, Java_home, and the variable value to be this. Okay, so once you're done configuring that, you click OK. By right here will be showing you for you to apply. You click on the apply and you click OK. Now, once you're done, we have done, like we've completed configuring the JDK file, right? Now, the next thing you have to do, you copy this WebGoat version and point it to the directory where you want it to sit. In this case, we point it into our C and under web application security, right? So we put it here. Then once we're done, okay, put in the jar file here. The next thing we need to do is just come here, create a new file, and we call this new file to be start WebGoat, or you can call it anything, WebGoat execute or whatever it is you want to call it. It's okay. Then you post this command. So here is that we are saying that you should start, this like an empty space, point to this directory C program files, Java, JDK23 binary, and of course java.exe. So you might be wondering why this is the part where it calls the Java to execute this WebGoat file, okay, which we have in our web application security. Okay, so I'll show you something. This is the JDK. If you go to bin, you can see Java, which is this one. Okay, you can see the date we created is on the 30th. Ignore this date because we're testing, like we said, we're testing some files, some codes. So we're, like doing some tracks with time to see if it's working on Windows environment. So basically, this is going to point to this and call this Java exe file to be able to run this WebGoat Java file. Okay, so remember, start space double quotes, empty double quotes. Okay, then quotes the directory where the java.exe file resides, then spacing minus -jar, then of course the full part where the Java file is. Okay, so now we just click on file, we'll say save as. Okay, we can come to C, we can come to web application security. Okay, we can now say start WebGoat. Then here we'll say batch file. Okay, ensure you select batch file. And ensure you're using Notepad++ to do this, okay? Then we save. Then it said this file is already open in Notepad. So the reason is that we opened this file previously. Okay, so this file doesn't exist anymore. Keep the file in. Yes, it's okay. So if we go back to our directory right now, okay, we create another name. Let's just say file. Save as start WebGoat01. Okay, then we'll save as batch file, right? Good. So now it has saved on our directory. So if we go there, you can see that it's here. It's because we previously have it in another creation in the Notepad++. So now we have, saved this here, right? The next thing we need to do is to now execute this file. And once we execute this file, you're going to see that WebGoat is going to start, executing. So now to run the WebGoat, we just come here. We just click on start. And you're going to see, you can see that the Java executed, we're showing the icon here, right? And you can see that our WebGoat is starting without any errors. Okay. Good. So once you see this create SQL, it means that the WebGoat is cool. It's running. Okay. In some cases, I don't know, for different users, it might not happen this way, but we'll show you one important thing. Once you see this, which is this, this URL path, it means that the WebGoat has started. So we can now come here. Okay. You can copy this. You can decide to copy this, Ctrl+C, and you go to your browser. So we already have it here anyway. So you just click on it. And WebGoat is running. And if we click sign in right now, then you can see our WebGoat is running. Okay, so that's how you solve these problems with executing the WebGoat on Windows 11, of course on Windows environment as well. So we decided to work this out so you can be able to get this solved and of course be able to practice the labs with the latest version of the WebGoat, which you have on your PC. And of course, follow the steps we run on our labs as well. So next is that we're going to show you how to use the LookyLoo tool, perform active recon on a target. Now, this is LookyLoo, okay? So LookyLoo is a very sophisticated tool and you can perform a single domain. You can perform multiple domains. So let's say you want to do multiple captures. You can just click on here and you put the different URLs per line. Okay, so let's say our first URL is FIXITGEARWARE.com. So per line, then we can say Facebook.com. We can say X.com. Now, we forgot to show you something. For LookyLoo, you have to put the protocol. So are you using HTTP or HTTPS? So in this case, we are using HTTPS. Okay. So this is for multiple domains, okay? Especially if you've performed the passive recon and you have a lot of domain on your list, right? Then here, this is the beautiful thing about LookyLoo. You can treat the browser configuration that is performing this active recon on the target to either act as a mobile phone or a desktop. So in this case, we can decide to make it to be a mobile phone. We can decide to make it to be a desktop, right? Now for operating system, you can select any operating system you want. If you're using for mobile phone, you can trick it to be Android version or iOS. Then if you're using for system, which is the desktop, you can choose it to be Ubuntu, Linux, different versions of macOS, and of course, different versions of Windows as well. So in this case, we can decide to use Windows XP. Then browser, we can decide it to be Internet Explorer 6 or whatever we want. So we choose this, and it's going to choose, the user agent as well, which is compatible with this version and so on. Now, this is the most beautiful thing about LookyLoo. So here on capture configuration, for those who are not, rich or do not have money to, buy VPN, here you can choose the Lacos instance to use. So you definitely leave it on default. There's nothing you can do. Then allow tracking. If you check this, you can allow, the website capture to violate your privacy, which of course we don't want that to happen, to track you, to get your actual IP and location, right? Now for proxy, you can choose France, you can choose Belgium, you can choose Germany. This is the few ones they can provide so far. And you can also choose Tor. So for Tor, it's going to randomize your location as well, right? So let's say we choose Germany. It uses WireGuard free, VPN services. So this keeps you anonymous as well. Then for viewport, you can choose whatever you want. Then referrer, you can put whatever you want as well if you want to use custom, or you can ignore this. So now I show you something. Once we're done, we just click start looking. And you see what LookyLoo is going to do. It's capturing the different website. Okay. And you have to wait until the status says capture ongoing, please wait, capture ongoing, please wait. So this is very good for you if you're performing, bug bounty related activities and you do not have money to buy VPN or, pay for VPN services, or you don't want to use CLI, which is the command line interface, to run your various tools you have, because one, your computer resource is quite, slow, and you don't have, money to buy a sophisticated computer. And once you see capture is done, you can now click show capture. And you can see the capture is right. Now, this is the legend. This legend is something very important. You have to follow this legend to see the things it captures. So from this legend, it's going to tell you in this list what it captured. Now, if you see here, we can now click this. Unblur this. You can see what X told us, that this browser is no more supported. So it's detecting we are using an obsolete browser. So we cannot use this browser to access their, resources. Then you can come here. Okay. I'll show you the analytical tools. So for here, we can say third-party reports. Let's see what we have. And you can see virus total, what virus total said about this. We can close this. Now we still come to historical lookups to see what we have. And here you can see we got the CNAME for X. You can see we got the different IP address. This is the IP address. This is the IP address. So you keep checking quite a lot, especially if you're, if you're dealing with domains that have a whole lot of resource. You can see for X, we have a lot of things, a lot of information. This is twitter.com, a valid catch, twitter.com, and so on. Now, let's go back again. Let's go to IP addresses. So this is the IP address, okay, that is associated with x.com. So we want to see the three nodes that it's pointing to the IP address. So X is pointing there, Twitter is pointing there, and x.com is pointing there. Now, one more thing again, I want to show you for favicons, especially if you're familiar with, hash, when you're pen testing targets, you want to know what, the hash value, to uncover, paths and so on. So it picks the favicon and of course tells you using show the hash for that favicon as well. So this is a very cool tool. It's very good. And you want to see other URLs that belongs to X as well. You can see how many there are. So basically, this is like basically we set X. Now, by right, let's say we perform passive recon, right? Information gathering. We can put it out there using the multiple, search or multiple capture using LookyLoo, and we get a lot of information about X and of course other things we want to know. And if we go back again to capture, we go to capture details. You can see we have page title wasn't found, and you can see our proxy was via Germany. So basically, X server will be reading that we are coming from Germany, but by right, we're not in Germany, right? Good. Now, we go back to our entries, okay? We wait for LookyLoo to load. Good. So these are our entries, right? These are our entries, the things we got. You can see there are quite a whole lot of information that we got. Now, you can see redirects. So for our website, it's always redirecting to our website. So for X, you can see when you type this, it redirects to this or this. You can see for some important information as well. For Facebook, Facebook should probably have a lot of things to do. Okay. There's quite a whole lot of things we can get on Facebook. Okay. So, we go back to, so we can go back to our capture. Okay. So this is for FIXITGEARWARE.com. It's still going to run again. Let's say for Facebook, let's show capture for Facebook. Okay. So here you can see, you see things that are put here, right? You just look at the legend and of course see what the legend says. So for this one, we say Facebook. Now this, it captures the front page. If we click here right now, you're going to see what's going to happen. We unblur this and you can see Facebook is telling us to allow cookies because it's detecting we're coming from, a proxy, and it captured the image as well. And if we click further here under this, right, see what's going to happen. Now you see it tells us about the manifest, and you can see the TLS there is the latest TLS version 1.3, valid from this. And of course, if you see Facebook here right now, it's from March to June, so it's 3 months, which is good security practice. Then we can click here, you can see encoding. Now this is also good for you, especially if you're performing looking for subdomains to pen test. You can come here, you can look for informations under content security policy under the HTTP headers, and of course extract these informations as well. Then the type of request, we tried some GET requests and we got status code 200, you can see here. And of course it took about 0.04 seconds to capture the information. And if we come here, you can see the image capture, X-frame deny. This is also very important. You can learn how the target operates, and find a way to use this to exploit the target. Then under TLS certificate, you can see currently it's still valid. They're using 1.3, which is the latest one, and of course it's only valid for 3 months. After 3 months, as in June, on June 15th, it's going to be renewed. Then for cookies as well, you can see a whole lot of things. So this is one important feature about LookyLoo. Okay, so don't worry about you not having money to buy VPN and so on, or you don't have the money to buy a strong computer that has the capacity to run sophisticated tools, and of course without eating your resources on your computing device. So use LookyLoo via the web. LookyLoo is very important. It's very, very cool tool, and always use the legend to refer to the results. You can see here we have for JavaScript, we have about 39. So we can just click here and see what we can pull out from that. Okay, so we keep scrolling. You can just scroll and see what you can pull. Now, this is the most beautiful thing about this. This is like the JavaScript, right? And we can copy this to clipboard and see what it has. Okay, let's see what it has. Good. So pulling this JavaScript right now, I can just, do some look into this JavaScript and see what I can pull out from this sensitive information. If there is any, some sort of weakness from Facebook, we can pull it from here. And you can also test this as well to see if you can try other vulnerabilities as well, such as open redirects. Just try and see what you can pull out with this. So you see how cool LookyLoo is. LookyLoo is very cool. It's a very awesome tool, and we're very thrilled that we're able to show you this week, and hope you can use it as a security researcher or as a bug bounty hunter. And especially for the newbies, we actually did this for you, and hopefully this will serve the purpose which you want to use it for. So guys, that's all for this week, and we hope you have learned something new. And if there's any question you have regarding LookyLoo, LookyLoo is quite a very interesting tool, and we have a lot of things we want to show you about it, but just explore it. It's not so complex, and you don't need to memorize commands. You just have to understand how the various UI works and how it works efficiently when you try to use for multiple domains or for single domains. If there's any question you have, do not hesitate to drop your comments in this video on our official YouTube channel here, or you can follow us on X, tag us, ask us any questions you want, and we'll be able to respond to you. Also, for this WebGoat series we demonstrated today, we'll be putting the command prompts on our official GitHub channel under the Texas page, where we list how you can resolve problems on Linux or any forms of environment you're using for your penetration testing event or activities. So check it out, especially the part how you can create the path for your webgoat.bat file to run without needing to open your terminal every time you want to run the command to use the webgoat jar file to practice your lab. So that will be all for this week. Please do not hesitate to subscribe. Ensure that you share with your friends, and we are planning and we're targeting to hit about 1K subscribers soon. So please keep trying your best to show some love and support. And of course, we did not forget our giveaway. And you just wait till the end of the month of June. We'll be running it because this month has been very hectic for us. We do not have time to even do proper content. As you can see, we've not been consistently active for the past 2 weeks. That's because we've been busy with a lot of activities. And we apologize for that in a very good way, not in a very bad way. And what else? See you next time on any related trainings on cybersecurity with FIXITGEARWARE-SECURITY. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.